Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. We are on day 147 of self-quarantine. On this week's show, we have Ken Klippenstein from The Nation. He is the DC correspondent, master of FOIAs and leaks, and boy does he have one that came out this week. The government is trying to investigate members quote-unquote members of Antifa. It's a jaw-dropping report. You'll want to stick around for that. But first, we have Jonathan Hirschman, who is a member of the Taaffee Tenant Association, which is out of Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. They are a group of renters, tenants, who are going door-to-door, organizing fellow tenants so that they can fight back against this evictions crisis that is looming across the nation. This is part of an ongoing series we are going to be doing on tenants' rights, because I can't tell you how many emails and messages I get from our patrons, from our listeners, from our viewers on what to do right now in this crisis. Millions of Americans are facing evictions, so we're going to make sure to cover that. But first, guys, if you are not already subscribing, make sure to click like and subscribe on YouTube and share on our social media, on Instagram at The Nomiki Show, on Twitter at The Nomiki Show. You can follow me on Facebook at Nomiki Konst. And of course, if you're not a patron, and those of you who are patrons, thank you, because we have some big announcements, and it's really because of you. But if you're not, you can join for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. If you want to go a little bit more, we've got fun swag. We have mugs and bags and stickers and some more stuff coming soon. But to those of you who are patrons, I definitely want to say thank you, because we have been able to build a show amidst COVID over the last 7 months. And as a result, we are going to be able to do a very exciting special during the Democratic National Committee, which is being held virtually now. It is going to start on August 17th. Mark your calendars, through August 21st, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific. It is 5 days a week. 1 hour show coming in right after the Majority Report, naturally, if you're watching that. But it's on our YouTube channel at The Nomiki Show. And for those of you who are patrons, you get a special show for the DNC, special interviews, and some extra archived coverage that we're going to be releasing that week. So double the whammy. And then the following week, we're going to do the RNC special. So make sure, if you're not already, subscribe to the channel here. And we'll be sharing some more promos and exciting guests in the coming days. So this week was seismic in terms of progressive wins. You know, we've had a few big progressive wins on the federal level in Congress, but this one was very personal to me. I'm sure you guys have seen my coverage on YouTube, in which I did a live stream talking about Cori Bush, who won. She won against an establishment, a dynasty that has been in office for over 50 years. Their names collectively, that name, Lacy Clay, has collectively been on the ballot in many different forms for 91 years. 91 years. William Lacy Clay had the seat in Missouri since 1991. And prior to that, his father had been in office since the late 60s. So Cori Bush, who had run against William Lacy Clay before, defeated the incumbent, but she didn't do it without hard work. Let me be very clear. Cori, she's a friend of ours. She was one of our founding members of Matriarch, the organization I'm on the board of, which supports working class progressive women running for Congress. But what Cori did was she did this really through hard work and you know, a very organized campaign and lessons learned from the previous election. The average time, they say, for a woman to run, the average number of times it takes is 3 times. So Cori has run 3 times. She's gotten her name out. She's built organization on the ground. She's not given up despite facing all types of obstacles. This is, you know, Cori is a nurse. She dealt with COVID while she was running. She was making phone calls from her hospital bed, which she had to go to twice. She was in the hospital twice. Her car was shot at, and that is not the first time that's happened. But before she ran, she had faced homelessness. She's a single mother. She has the financial stress that so many working people across this country have dealt with. And what is despicable is that her opponent used that against her as if it were an attack. And you're going to see more of this coming out. But what I really appreciate about Cori is that she did this in a very independent way. Nobody swooped in to save her. She had the support of some groups. She had Bernie Sanders' endorsement. She was a surrogate for Bernie Sanders. But all of that was really, all that energy came in really after she built the organization on the ground, after she had run twice before, after she had organized in the community as a Black Lives Matter organizer, leader, amidst the Ferguson uprisings. And of course, in her campaign, she was out there on the ground, organizing and fighting back. And her community saw that. This is going to be an interesting election year. I mean, I think so far we've seen the importance of coalitions in winning these races. And there was somewhat of a coalition, but I think what made this historic and seismic is that she ran against somebody who did not have high unfavorables like an Elliot Engel did, or even a Joe Crowley in some ways. She did not run against somebody who was not invested in the community. He showed up in the community, went to events. He brought home the bacon, the pork spending, as they like to say in politics. But there was something missing. And I think what's happening right now is in communities across the country, people are feeling the pain due to COVID, the economic stress. If they are not already dealing with it, they're going to be dealing with it soon. So there's fear. There's, of course, a housing crisis. And in communities like Ferguson and St. Louis, the uprisings against a status quo political dynasty that has protected the police departments who have inflicted so much pain on these communities, that I think resonates deeply. And Cori was able to build a campaign operation that articulated a message that was different from Lacey Clay's. She was able to get her name out there, to get out there and talk to folks, despite the fact that campaigning during COVID has been so difficult, and it really has to be done through media. And that's where I think, we're grateful to have worked alongside Cori at her leadership, really, and helping amplify as much as possible. But moving forward, I think one thing that we should be paying attention to is these turnouts. The turnout right now is extraordinarily high because so many states have had to incorporate mail-in systems. Now, Democrats with the big D, the Democratic Party, they have fought against voter suppression in general elections for years. They fought against, they talk about how Trump is trying to privatize the Postal Service, the most popular service in the country, because Trump wants to keep turnout low in the general election. But let me be pretty clear here. As someone who lives in New York, a Democratic state, someone who fought on the Unity Reform Commission, the Democratic Party cares about voter suppression in the general election, but not in the primaries, because ultimately what happens in the primaries is what happened in Cori Bush's race. You get higher turnout from progressives, from working people who don't have to take a day off work or hours off work to go and vote, working people who may have had to move several times in recent years, and their voting registration may be lost along the way. Students, young people, they often say young people don't vote. Well, a lot of that has to do with young people being more mobile, young people not being locked into one residence for years and years. It's not necessarily, as the establishment likes to say, because young people are apathetic. There might be a little bit of that. But, that's what comes with life. You learn as you go. And especially with young people facing such financial burden, whether it's student loan debt or just the cost of living, as we see with the Zoomers and of course, millennials organizing around the Sunrise Movement and other organizing on the ground across the country, they're fed up as well. But voting has been incredibly difficult during primaries, as we know. And the states that have the more open democratic laws have higher turnout, especially west of the Mississippi. So let this be a lesson to us. A lot of states have been forced to create mail-in systems that do actually increase turnout, and that helps challengers. As I've said before, when you have closed primary rules, it's for incumbent protection. Incumbent protection. Because incumbents have the name ID, They have a little star next to their name on the ballot because they've been elected or they are the incumbents. But, it's about keeping that universe of voters tight, the most likely voters to turn out every cycle, to remember who their names are, and to keep voting for them every cycle. And if you open up those voting laws, it creates an opportunity for challengers to come in and speak to an expanded group of voters who may not be as familiar with the incumbent's name or may not be as open to the incumbent. So I think we're going to see some more shocks. We have another set of primaries coming up in the next month, but this has been an interesting election, and I think it's going to carry on through the general election. So congratulations to our friend Cori Bush. If you have not seen our interview with Cori Bush, she made me cry. Go back in the archives on YouTube, on Patreon. She gave a great interview, and shout out to Sam Cedar, who hosted MSNBC this week. He filled in for Chris Hayes, where he also interviewed Cori Bush at the end of the show. You want to go check that out. That was on August 7th on Friday on MSNBC. All right, guys, we have a great show, and make sure to click that like and subscribe, because we want to build this show up as we go into our DNC coverage next week. Civvy is an app that helps you find the politicians that best align with your beliefs. Whether quarantining at home alone or with family, it's as if it were the holidays. Gone are the days of no politics at the dinner table. We talk about our positions and express our support of politicians that we believe support our ideals. But in truth, how can we be sure that they actually do? There is a lot of noise out there. And recently, it feels like our assumptions about the world are being challenged every day. Civvy is an app here to help you navigate the world of information around you, to help you better grow, develop, and understand your political leanings and where you fit in today's political landscape. Their algorithm fills the content based on your stances, shows you leaders who actually match your values, and independent media to help keep you informed. The more you use it, the better it grows. Find Civvy on iTunes today. If you didn't believe that fascism is on its way or happening, I think an article that came out this week in The Nation by DC correspondent Ken Klippenstein, highlighting how Homeland Security is quietly tying Antifa to foreign powers. It's an intelligence report that he obtained through his magical powers. I don't know how he does it. Off camera, he just told me a few tips, but I don't believe it. I think he's got some sort of in there. Maybe there's a coup happening internally. But this is a report that mentions several Americans, including some that you may be aware of or fans of, that are on this essentially like a terrorism watch list of some sort where they're spying on them. Ken, thank you for joining us. First time guest, I can't believe it because we're friends and we've known each other for a while. We were old colleagues at TYT. So you've been doing great reporting with FOIA in particular. This is a leaked document though, right? This is something that somebody sent to you. Can you describe as much as you can, protecting your source, how this came about?
Well, these agencies, when we talk about Department of Homeland Security, are not monolithic. There's a bunch of different folks within them. Well, DHS, I would say, is generally one of the more partisan agencies. You look at the subcomponents like Border Patrol and ICE, their unions have endorsed Trump. That's extremely unusual for law enforcement, federal law enforcement agencies to do that. There's generally supposed to be a sort of culture of neutrality. For example, if you compare them to FBI, they've not endorsed Trump. They don't even have a union to do so, but they have other groups that could. But yeah, if you look at these agencies, whatever one may think of them, there's a range of opinions within them. And particularly under this administration, I think you're seeing more dissension than you've ever seen at any point during this administration. Now, it's not a particularly old one. I want to point out that this is a post 9/11 agency forged in the flames of the 9/11 attacks, and all of the fear and anxiety and paranoia, contained therein. But that being the case, there are still folks within it that think that it's being pushed too far by this administration. And I should point out, these are not necessarily liberals or progressives or, left individuals by any means. These are folks that, want to be able to do their job with some measure of integrity. And they feel as though these missions being sent to Portland, for instance, and a civil unrest response against the wishes of local and state government there, frankly, they view these things as dishonorable and counterproductive and undermining the mission that they feel they signed up for when they try to join. So that's speaking broadly. I have a bunch of folks in DHS that have helped me with things in the past, that I run these sorts of, it's always a group effort when you have a story, because you got to run things by other people, see what it means, verify that it is what the first person said it was. But I would say by and large, that is the attitude of the folks that decide to reach out at great risk to themselves, I should point out, to do this in the middle of a pandemic when if you're, laid off or fired, it's gonna be hard to find work. So it's something that I appreciate a lot, and have been taken aback just to see the kind of moral impulse behind a lot of this.
So, before we get to the report, is there a sense of why they are there? I think a lot of us on the left would question just the whole entire structure of DHS, including ICE as part of it, as you mentioned. What do they think their actual mission is?
Well, I think there are legitimate things that DHS does. A misconception about them is that, when we have this debate about, should we abolish, ICE or abolish DHS, there are components within it that were under different agencies prior to 9/11. So, for example, components of DHS were under Treasury, maybe under Justice. And a lot of folks inside DHS say they want to go back to that state of affairs because they felt that things were run better then. They felt their mission was less politicized. They felt like, they were just able to do a more honest job. And so when you hear that sort of description, it'd be interesting to me to see what the, folks that purvey this kind of hysterics about, oh my God, they want to get rid of everything. Like, this is anarchy. It's like, no, there's a whole range of options that are contained within this notion of dismantling ICE. You could entirely get rid of components. You could send the components back to where they were before. You could get rid of some certain ones. There's a whole bunch of different things we can do. And that's a debate that's happening within DHS. It's so funny to me when they act like these things are just the demands of, leftist activists. I can tell you that there are people with, purely logistic concerns that feel they'd be able to, be more effective and efficient. I'll give you an example. When you talk about ICE, people think of the guys that, break up families and are deporting people. That's part of what ICE does. But that's primarily the task of what's called enforcement and removal officers. That's part of ICE. There's another part of ICE called Homeland Security Investigations that historically has never had an immigration mission. They have a little bit of one now, and the extent to which they have an immigration mission now, they hate it because they want to go back to what they were doing before, which was human trafficking, worrying about things like bombs and things coming through, stuff that was shipped across the border, stuff that I don't think people would, by and large, disagree with as a mission. They resent having to, do. I've had multiple people come to me and tell me, look, I didn't sign up to, break up families. Like, I hate that I have to do this. And in addition to that, they'll say that it makes their own police work, to the extent that they're not, doing immigration stuff, it makes it harder. They say that when they see an ICE badge, a migrant or a person isn't going to know that they're an HSI. They're going to be, oh my God, ICE. I won't want to talk to these guys. And they said that the reputational effect has been so corrosive that they can't even do basic stuff completely unrelated to immigration anymore.
Yeah, so much of what law enforcement's, reformers in the law enforcement community talk about is building trust in communities, and this is essentially fracturing those agencies. Whatever your opinion is on them, reform or defund or abolish, this is not the way to do it properly. So this report is crazy. I actually, not the famous person, I know somebody on this report, which is whole experience to read about it from a different perspective. But actually, from a personal perspective, like knowing someone and knowing their story and then seeing how the administration essentially interprets their story is pretty mind-boggling, because it is, reading it just shows how partisan and slanted, and I think just from the basis of how they define Antifa and what they define it as, in particular, is kind of like the premise of why this is such a jaw-dropping report. But of course, the consequences are historic. So let's talk about, what are the basics of this report?
So this intelligence report provided me by someone within DHS shows that their intelligence is trying to tie folks they consider Antifa to foreign militant groups, in particular Kurdish militias that fought ISIS. And I want to point out that's something they did with Defense Department support.
Yes.
And, intelligence from the Pentagon, coordination with them. So to characterize this as some kind of, shady, are they terrorists or something, is ludicrous, because then you're saying the Pentagon is a terror. Like, I don't know that that's something they want to pursue, but in any case,
fought ISIS. Like, I didn't know this was a controversy. Just that alone. Right. And you talk to folks in the Defense Department, from the, Army to the Navy, Marines, they, I have never heard anyone that was like, I don't like the, Kurds. Like, I don't like working with them. I don't trust. By and large, they're like, no, this is a very important regional partner that's able to do things or not. So actually, before we even get to that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for those of you who aren't aware, there was a group of people, and please clarify, Ken, if you can. There were a group of people, many who had, not all of them, but many who had military training, who were part of the U.S. military at one point, or were on reserves, or whatever their story was, went there on their own to Syria and fought as individuals, as men and women. You can find, there's a Rolling Stone article, I believe, from 2017. I think you link it in there. It's a crazy story, but they went as individuals in fighting ISIS. So it was not something, they were coordinating, of course, especially after so many went there, but it wasn't something that there was no, I guess these are people who actually had for more or less was organized.
Yeah. And then, as in the case of one of them, Brace Belden, who had been targeted in this report, he's a host of a very popular podcast called True and None. He's a left-wing guy, endorsed Bernie, was a, big Bernie Sanders proponent in 2016 and also now in 2020. I talked to him, and so he says he went out there, he wanted to fight ISIS. That was his view. Not particular, zeal for whatever the group is he's fighting with, more just wanting to fight ISIS, and then comes back after about a year. And that's, pretty much the extent of it. And then now you have the Department of Homeland Security trying to say that, scrutinizing him and others to try to make a case for that they are receiving directions, quote, marching orders from the document from these foreign groups. That's very scary, because I don't know how much folks know about national security law. It's sort of arcane. But if you're able to demonstrate that someone is acting at the behest of a foreign power, then you can strip away all sorts of civil liberties that we would consider really cornerstone to membership in a free society. So, for example, they if you can be shown to be a representative of a foreign power, something that traditionally has to be done by the FISA court, it stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, as the title would suggest, you can start to do all sorts of really invasive types of surveillance. You can start to do electronic surveillance. They could hack into your phone. They could try. The amount of resources that a national that our national security apparatus has is really astonishing. So I can't overstate how invasive it is if they're able to show that. Now, thankfully, the document itself says, we weren't able to find a whole lot except on one individual. But the thought that they're even looking for this is an intimation of what the administration is looking for right now. And what I'm being told from folks within other national security departments within the federal government is that this is a big push. This is a sort of program to try to nail Antifa on whatever grounds they can find.
Antifa, of course, is not an actual organization.
Yeah. Try to join it. Go out and say, I'd like to join. Can I have a membership card? See what happens. You're not going to get anything because they don't have the intelligence report mentions this itself. It says it's a sort of attitude, a general tendency. There's no actual formal membership. There's no leadership. And they're exactly right. There isn't this notion that there's some shadowy Borg of Antifa super soldiers somewhere. It doesn't work that, Antifa, it stands for anti-fascist. I would think a lot of people would identify themselves as opposed to fascism, probably the majority of the country. And so the way that the document itself describes it, and the federal government generally has, as I've seen it, they describe it as inclusive of all sorts of different tendencies, from socialists to anarchists to communists to, people generally opposed to authoritarianism. That is
they know nothing about it. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Try to get those people all together in one meeting and not. Yeah, exactly. So, how long have they been working on this? Do you have a sense of that?
When President Trump announced about several weeks ago, he vowed that he was going to designate Antifa a terrorist organization. The same day that he did that, ironically enough, I was given another intelligence report from a source of mine within the FBI showing that there had been no evidence of, Antifa links to violence committed in the DC area, which, there was a lot of unrest at that point. And presumably that was the whole reason Trump made the statement, because he said it after, I don't remember if it was the tear gassing in front of the White House of protesters, but it was some big conflict. And so, that was really representative. And my understanding is that the subsequent intelligence reports that came out still couldn't find any evidence of it. That's not to say they didn't find evidence of sponsorship of violence, but that was attributable to far right groups, anti-government groups, things like that. Not white supremacist groups, not Antifa. So, evidence for group involvement in violence exists. It just happens to cut in the opposite direction of what they're saying. There was a recent report on The Guardian that summarized the results of a study done by, I think it was a university. They found that in the last 25 years, whatever you think of Antifa, they haven't killed a single person. If you compare that to white supremacist threat or the far right threat, which, by the way, President Trump's own FBI director Chris Wray, says that is the primary and salient terror concern, and he's right. They've killed dozens of people in the last year or two. So there's no comparison. And but that's maybe not the point. This could be, and folks in the intelligence community speculate and say this to me too, and kind of hinted they know more than they can say, because parts of this may be classified, or no more than they're sometimes willing to say. Have intimated that this, despite the facts, the priority right now is Antifa, this poorly defined, loosely defined group.
So when you say no more than they're willing to say about the intentions of the administration, or that this group of folks that... I
mean, these operations.
Right.
Because, I understand there was a lot more going on in Portland than is publicly known.
Yeah.
That they've got the Justice Department to sign off on things that we don't know. And, the problem is that we have a profoundly not forthcoming administration in terms of what they're up to. What we know is that when President Trump issued his executive order on the monuments of all things, if you read the text of that, we all kind of laughed at the monuments part because it was funny, but it also includes protecting federal property, which is extraordinarily broad. And so that authorized the Department of Homeland Security to then, in response, create a task force called the Protecting American Communities Task Force, or PACT for short. That isn't RoboCop enough of a title for a task force. Under that, they were able to send Border Patrol units. I should point out, DHS is the biggest law enforcement agency in the country, far bigger than, if you compare the size of Border Patrol to, say, FBI, far more agents. People don't understand this. You compare it to DEA, you compare it to the Marshals. They're just way bigger, less training in general, less disciplined, more partisan, more responsive, because that's what DHS was designed to do. They were designed to be more responsive to the president. When you look at the Justice Department, we're adults. We know that things aren't perfect, and it doesn't live. It's not as neutral as they'd have you think. However, they at least have the presumption, or at least both publicly and culturally inside, the perception is that they are not supposed to be an outfit or arm or extension of the White House. That's not the case with DHS. It's supposed to be much more responsive to the White House and the president. That was what it was intended to do. And now we're seeing a president who's willing to push that to its limits. And it's really frightening.
So this was all based off of this article that came out in Rolling Stone. Is that sort of where they got this idea of okay, here's the in. The in is we tie these folks who are in this article, who now have Antifa flags on their Twitter accounts or whatever it is, or supportive of the protests, because we know that they were in Syria. We tie that. That's our way in. Is that they worked in Syria, they fought with against ISIS, and that's our way into building a larger narrative around the organization, quote unquote organization of Antifa and the activists who are fighting law enforcement agencies on the ground. Is that kind of what their yes. legal path is?
Yeah, my understanding is that this is one of several things that they're throwing against the wall to see what sticks. And we don't yet know what the other attempts are, but this is an indication that there's a push, as I'm told, towards this. I'm sure we're going to see more come out in terms of, getting a terror designation is hard if you've got a domestic group, as it should be, because people have civil liberties and they have protections. People don't, it shouldn't be easy for a White House or any authority to just say, oh, this person is a, enemy of the state. So, that this was one tactic. It seemed like they weren't able to dredge up a whole lot. Maybe the guy didn't even have his heart in it. The way it's written, they certainly tried, but a lot of times they're assigned these ridiculous intelligence products that they have to end up, answering questions to. But the question now is how far this goes and what else they're doing, because this is what we know, but this is just the part of the iceberg that you can see. I can only speculate what the rest is.
So we don't really have a sense of how long this is going to go on, but this is happening in an election year. And I think, just naturally, the question is, well, why now? The protests obviously been happening. The uprisings have been happening. Portland, it's even more concerning, especially with how law enforcement has reacted. But, we are effectively 4 months away from an election, a presidential election, in which many states will have mail-in ballots and early voting. So, let's just say we're about, 3 months away from an election. If we're being, the most generous with our, with our electoral strategies here. Why would he do this now? What gain does he have out of this? It's just very confusing to me strategically as to why Donald Trump would do this in an election year.
Well, let's look at Portland, which I think is really, if not the origin, the focal point of a lot of this stuff against using the national security apparatus against the Antifa. He was permitted to send federal forces again in contravention of the wishes of local and state government to the state on grounds that he's meeting some kind of threat to federal property there. I could see certain, applications and utility for something like that as we get closer to election day, if he were, for example, to do that in swing states where, Democrats rely on ethnic minorities to turn out and, vote for them. And, if you have federal agents, we know the state of, policing in this country, maybe that would have an effect. Again, I'm just speculating. This could well be just some ludicrous plan that the president had. I'll tell you a very funny story. After I reported this, I was told by some folks, I was told by a friend of mine that covers more Middle East stuff, and they sent me an article showing this, that President Trump had actually met with Erdogan at one point. Erdogan had suggested to him, planted the idea in his head, that Antifa was working with the Kurds. And the Turkish president, of course, has his own motives for something like this because he hates the Kurds. The Kurdish people are a really mistreated minority within the Turkish government. So it could be that this was just some crazy, anxiety and sort of paranoia that had been implanted in him, and it's limited to that. It could be part of a bigger machination of deploying federal assets closer to the election to try to have an effect on turnout, as we know the GOP does, not necessarily with federal troops, but trying to suppress votes. It's a demonstrable fact that is part of their electoral strategy. Or it could be both. These things are not mutually exclusive. There are elements within the Trump administration that are far more competent and familiar with the levers of bureaucracy and federal power so for example, William Barr, he has a long and storied history, very interesting figure, going back to the George H.W. Bush administration. He was able to after a hurricane that affected the U.S. Virgin Islands, he was able to construct very subtle and sort of obscure legal basis to send federal troops there to respond to what they perceived as unrest. Again, without the support of the local and municipal government there. So he has practice doing these things. He's an expert at constructing these kind of things. Perhaps he has his own designs that the President Trump may not even be aware of. Maybe they're talking together. I can only speculate. What I do know is that there's precedent, contained within the DNA of the Portland mission is Barr's decades of expertise at concentrating power in the executive branch, which I think should be extremely concerning coming into this election.
Just going back to the point about Turkey, not even a year ago, I believe, when we pulled out our troops out of the border between Syria and Turkey. I mean, that's things have, obviously with COVID, everything's a little bit different now, but the warning was things would escalate, and they did. So I'm curious if there's any sort of connection there, of course, as well. So
yeah, that's really important context. So in the context of all this, President Trump had withdrawn troops, which let the Kurds just get, attacked by Turkish troops. As I mentioned before, the Turkish government, especially Erdogan, has treated the Kurds terribly. And that was to, enormous consternation within the Defense Department, not just publicly, but folks I know were furious about this. Because as I said before, they do not regard these groups as terrorists. They regard them as, allies in the fight against ISIS, who took enormous casualties in that fight, and we're willing to do things on the ground that the U.S. government was not willing to send, our soldiers to do. They literally took bullets for, our own armed forces. So they were extremely angry about that, all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. And when, Secretary James Mattis, then Defense Secretary, resigned, he actually cited this as one of the reasons for his resignation and one of the principal, points of disagreement with President Trump. So that was an extremely unpopular position for him to take. And I think indicative of willingness on his part to either do what Erdogan asked or something consistent with Erdogan's interest for, you could speculate as to why, but that he has done these sort of crazy things before, there's certainly precedent for that.
Fascists of the world unite. So related, today, the New York Times published a story about how, intelligence agencies say that Trump that Russia is, of course, meddling in the election again. And that, of course, this is again, like the intelligence agencies said this to the New York Times. The New York Times published this, and they also published that it is believed that, China is working against Trump in some way or form, but not as obtrusive as Russia is. So how is that related to this? Do you have any sense?
These intelligence agencies, it seems like they are just becoming, so much more politicized in the wake of 2016. I'm not saying that it's bad that they're looking at, foreign states trying to meddle in elections. That's fine. That's good. But the release of these reports is though, it's kind of like, this person is endorsed by this nation state, and this nation state doesn't.
Exactly. That's how I read it too.
You know what I mean? Like,
what is going on?
It's sort of childish. Like, I don't doubt that Russia would prefer to have Trump. I don't dispute that. These intelligence agencies, when what you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And what they are designed to do is counter foreign influence. They are designed for. It's like the thing we were talking about before with terrorism. They're designed to find foreign influence. It's called counterintelligence. They're designed to counter the intelligence apparatus of adversary states. So they're going to find that. And they always, it's within their charter to do so, and that's what they do. What's different now is the way in which it's getting leaked and sort of reported and framed as though, if you like this candidate, then that means that maybe you're with this government, and that's when it gets into, we can have a rational debate about, it makes sense to me that people don't want, interference in any election. But what we've got to be careful to do is not move in this direction of trying to, smear people as associated with some certain country or other.
Exactly.
If you like Biden or Trump.
Exactly. And also be aware that when we say Turkey and Russia, we're declaring their leaders. Just want to make that extremely clear, because I hear the comments online. It's always interesting talking about foreign policy on a leftist show. I just gotta leave it there, especially when it intersects in this way. Ken, really fascinating reporting as always. I would love to have you back on when you break your next big story. I don't know how you do it, but you do it, and you do it well, especially in COVID times when you can't take people out to bars and undisclosed locations and get the tips.
Exactly. Oh, it's such a headache, but I'll keep hammering away.
I know, it's really good work. So you can check out the story up at The Nation right now. The title of the article is, we'll put it in the section below. The title of the article is "Homeland Security is Quietly Tying Antifa to Foreign Powers," published on August 3rd. Thank you, Ken.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers. Millions of Americans are facing eviction. We already had a housing crisis across the country, especially in big cities, who have had rising housing costs due to massive development and tax incentives. But now that is exacerbated isn't even the right word. Whatever exacerbated times 10 is what Americans are facing right now. And we won't even know how serious this is probably for several months once it really starts to stick into the economy. So there are tenants groups across the country that are organizing to get stronger tenants laws, to get stronger housing laws, and in New York State, just a year and a half ago, we had some of the weakest tenants laws in the country. But due to great organizing by activists, New Yorkers were able to defeat 8. There was a group of members of the Senate called the IDC. You may recall I've covered them before. They were holding up quite a few laws in New York, preventing progress, preventing protections. But part of that was because real estate had essentially bought off these 8 senators caucusing with Republicans, the real estate industry, which is a very powerful force in New York State and city. Luckily, the IDC was defeated, and the Senate is now controlled by the Democrats again. And in the last year, we were able to have some housing laws passed. Of course, there's always more room to grow. And of course, we're seeing why that's important right now. Jonathan Hirschman is one of the organizers out of the Clinton Hill group, the Taaffee Tenant Association. And he's here to tell us a little bit about the work that they're doing in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, which, of course, is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, okay, did this tenants association exist prior to COVID-19?
It kind of started to form slightly before, but COVID really accelerated the effort and caused people to come together pretty quickly.
It's interesting because there's been a lot of organizing, as you know, because you're a New Yorker. There's been quite a bit of organizing on the ground around protecting tenants and taking on big real estate. I mean, my campaign personally was a big part of that. In that the real estate industry, the developers in particular, have been able to basically, my words, buy off our politicians, supposed progressive politicians here in New York City. And the consequences, as we're seeing right now, are incredibly severe. So are you seeing a shift in local political response, given the fact that these tenants organizing groups are popping up around the city?
Well, our attitude, and I think our observation, is that no help is coming from the government. And that it's up for neighbors to help neighbors in solidarity. And so we focus particularly on that. We have in the past, tenants in the buildings that we represent have tried a political solution in the past with limited success. So at this point, we're taking it into our own hands.
So what does that mean? How do you take it to your own hands? What can neighbors do for each other?
So the first thing I'll just mention is, and I'm sure you're aware about how in New York City, no one knows the people that live in their buildings. So the first thing was really, and I have to say, I can't take credit for this. We had some amazing people that got this ball rolling, to build trust between neighbors. And the next step was to educate, get volunteers, learn about the situation. We're making this up a lot as we go along, and ultimately it culminated in 60 households in our association paying to retain an attorney to defend the most vulnerable and to take other actions. And again, we're just, we're doing it ourselves. People that are very distressed are still coming up with $50 a month to donate towards retained counsel.
So as of right now, there is a moratorium on evictions in New York City and New York State. Every state, let me just be very clear, every state has its own set of laws. So if you don't live in New York, I just want to be very clear, make sure to do as much research as possible about your community and your states and your city's laws, because they're not always the same. But in New York City, we have an eviction moratorium for tenants. I think it's just been expanded to September. Is that correct?
It's till September 4th. It does not apply to many distressed renters.
Why is that?
If you, again, my understanding may be incomplete, so anyone should check my homework. But if you had a situation with a landlord prior to March 7th, you may not be getting this protection. And there may be other carve-outs that I'm not aware of. It's kind of just strong enough to kick the can, down the road, and that's about it.
Okay, so just to be clear, prior to March 7th, meaning like COVID-19 related rentals. So, yeah. So, okay, so you're going door to door, and how are your are the tenants in these buildings responding, and do they understand what's going on, and like how many do you feel are really affected by this?
It's interesting you say that. One of the things that I've observed is that the business model of landlords is individualized and weak and uninformed tenants. It's literally their business model. And if tenants are continuing to be that way, they're effectively helping the landlord against their own best interests. What we found is that a lot of people are just in denial about the severity of the situation. They think that the economy is going to come back any minute. They think that the vaccine is coming next week. And people that still have a job, and our unemployment in our neighborhood is around 25%. They think that it's never going to touch them. They don't understand that the landlord has already taken actions against their best interests, even if they're up to date on their rent and everything else. So it's really difficult to get through apathy and to some degree some willful ignorance. But once people start to break through, and we've had pretty good success in doing it, they become incredibly engaged. And we have amazing people in our association. And I'm privileged to have been able to meet all of them and to break that New York cycle of not knowing your neighbor. So that's been the silver lining, actually.
It's interesting. It's always communities that come together. So as you're doing this work, I can imagine that you've been doing this for the last few months. How many doors have you knocked on in which there was a tenant there the previous month and now there's not? They're moving.
It's hard to say. The landlord actually plays a shell game to make it look like there's less vacancy than there is. We're guessing that the vacancy that the landlord has across five buildings, around 350 units, is between 10 and 20%, which matches up with city averages. They are helped a little bit because we're near local colleges, so there's a lot of transient students that are getting some bargains right now. But yeah, I mean, what's I think more interesting is not necessarily the people that are moving out, but what people are doing to cope with the situation. So a next door neighbor of mine, instead of moving out because he couldn't make rent, brought in a whole bunch of sheetrock, made a lot more bedrooms, and just crowded more roommates in that would each pay less in order to make rent, which is, really underscores the fact that bad housing policy is bad public health policy.
Absolutely. And meaning because there's more people in one home. When the virus spread in New York, they realized very quickly that people who have more residents in a household, families, et cetera, roommates, it was spreading at a more rapid rate.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. So, you're organizing, you're educating folks. How are you specifically fighting back? What are some of the policies that you're trying to get passed or changed so that renters are protected right now?
Well, we have a few different goals. The first thing is I should mention our landlord, Alma Realty. We initially attempted to engage with them without attorneys, just to have a discussion. And they refused to do that. They would not speak to us in any kind of collective situation. What we've asked Alma for is an understanding that there should be, it comes down to some shared pain. It seems very inequitable that the landlord gets their margin and that, the residents are almost 100% have a substantial loss of income due to this situation. The landlord doesn't understand that the market that existed before people signed their last lease no longer exists. And that I think there's a reasonable discussion. We're not looking for free rent. We're just looking for a little bit of help and a little bit of understanding and to keep people in their homes.
What's so interesting about that, that's exactly the point, is this isn't the economy that existed prior to COVID-19, which, let's be clear, was quite a bit of a landlord's market. There was a decade of growth in this city, really 2 decades since 9/11, but the last decade, the city has grown so fast. Rents have become increasing rapidly out of control in terms of prices. There's been little to no rent control up until a year ago, barely any. And of course, wages have stayed pretty low. And so it's really pushed people out of their communities, and communities have changed very fast, which is always very good for landlords, very good for developers to come in and build high rises in communities that, they probably would have seen as, quote, untouchable, 5 years prior. And it's not only that, they've designed this. They have economic models that build into forecast, 10, 15 years from now. So I'm wondering, if they're just not, from a tactical perspective, they're just not really putting their thinking caps on and thinking like this community is going to change.
Well,
is it quarterly to quarterly? Like, I'm trying to think like what are they, if everyone leaves, you don't have a building. If 40% of New Yorkers move out, your business model doesn't work either. Wouldn't you want to help them so that a few months from now, hopefully they'll be able to afford rent again, even if it's less than it was before?
Well, interesting. There are dynamics that may not be obvious. What we found is that the situation with landlords and our landlord is a lot like corporate America in general. A lot like the sins of corporate America. So one example of that is that our landlord for the buildings in our association is highly leveraged. The business model isn't as much in collecting rent as it is in every few years getting a larger and larger mortgage and sweeping that extra money into their coffers. So at this point, before the pandemic, we estimated that about somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the gross rents were going to service their debt. And so, yeah, when you get into now this is a back of the envelope calculation, and it may be somewhat inaccurate, but it's a pretty substantial amount of the gross goes to pay the debt. So when suddenly you have high vacancy rates, and the trends that had powered New York City for so many years have just completely reversed, they may no longer have the ability to do anything about it. They may have no choice. I mean, there's no sympathy here, but they may have painted themselves into a corner, much the way that the airlines, used their money to do stock buybacks and then didn't have any reserves to do anything in a downturn. We're seeing that situation play out, in a microcosm with our landlord. That's not the renter's problem. But if the landlord is not conducting its business appropriately, but that may be one explanation for their stubborn refusal to accept reality. They may not have a choice.
This is so interesting because like your landlord, I live in Astoria, and I if I'm correct, I think they're based out of Astoria, and I've been reading them in the news for a while because they got in a lot of trouble with how they were dealing with tenants. And some of the tactics is like now suddenly they want to keep the tenants there. But for years, a lot of these landlords were trying to move out, lower, whatever rent control that might have existed. They're trying to push out tenants who are locked into their rental rates so that they could bring in new tenants and charge them much more and, quote unquote, have upgrades, whatever it is, some excuse to move them in. So what are some experiences you guys have faced with your landlord and, being very careful here because they're all very litigious?
Yes. So one of the things that we are aware of, we've heard anecdotally, is that, well, one of the things the landlord has done, this is just factual, so I'm not sure they can really sue me, is that they were distributing questionnaires saying, hey, if you're having a problem, fill out this questionnaire. What they didn't really make obvious to tenants was that questionnaire was being shared with their attorneys, and that in fact the next step after filling out the questionnaire would be for the attorneys to contact tenants and ask for pretty intrusive financial information. What do you have in the bank? What is your income history? Which is something for obvious reasons you do not want to share with a landlord or the landlord's attorneys. More to the point, the reason why they were doing that was actually in the case that litigation happened. Now, this is my understanding. I can't really say this is their motivation, but that it would be something that could be used against tenants in court, either if someone didn't fill out the questionnaire, well, we didn't know they were having a problem, and if they did fill out the questionnaire, well, look, they have a trust fund or maybe an investment, and so they have money. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for the tenants to engage with the landlord that way. The landlord has asked tenants who are seeking help to sign non-disclosure agreements with, from what we understand, some pretty severe stipulations, but I can't say that I've actually read one. This has been something that's been told to me anecdotally. But signing an NDA that lasts for the rest of your life, which is something we have heard repeatedly, I think is kind of high-handed. For someone that's just looking for help and is desperate. The landlord is, that also has the effect of peeling people out of a tenants association. If someone signs an NDA, there's just an inherent conflict of interest and they can no longer be part of our efforts. And I'm sure that's probably part of their strategy as well. So that's we've also
it's like
seen
union busting, basically.
it is union busting, and the thing is that tenant associations don't have the protection of a labor union, and they really should. I mean, that would be one of the things that if a politician asked us what we wanted, we would ask for that, because having those protections, it would be a very tenant-friendly thing to do.
Are you seeing any sort of progress from politicians at all? Anybody? I know I asked you at the top, but there's got to be some movement. I mean, the cancel rent movement is very strong. DSA has been organizing lots of tenants associations popping up, and I think, you know, New York politicians in particular, many of whom are facing elections, city council members, for those watching in New York, are being termed out. Some are being termed out next year. Some are up for re-election next year. So check your neighborhood and see who's on board. But, you know, is there any sort of anything, assembly members?
As far as I'm aware, we have no white knights, and I think that really this is an indication of just how powerful the real estate interests are. Because when you look what's going on, New York City is losing its human capital.
Yeah.
I mean, we're eating our seed corn. If you look at our association, we have an amazing range of people. We have artists, musicians, educators, architects, people that work in the entertainment industry, craftspeople. I mean, literally finance. We are literally a cross-section of what makes New York City great, a destination capital. And those people are leaving because of this situation, because there's no help for the renters, and, you know, they're being denied the benefits of New York City themselves. And eventually it becomes a decision like, why am I even here? My company's going work from home. New York City is ignoring all of this dynamic. And once they lose that ecosystem, that human capital infrastructure, New York City is no longer what it used to be. I mean, it will not be what it used to be. They need to really pay attention to this. It's shocking that they're not.
Yeah, it was already getting there. I mean, I remember during my campaign, just how many conversations I was having with people, and this is like a 4-month campaign, but we really tried to go into the roots of inequity in the city, because it is as of, you know, March, it was the most unequal city in the country. It's always competing with San Francisco and Seattle, and for different reasons. But here, I mean, it's very much rooted in real estate. It's very much rooted in the developers who have, like I said, they've designed. Actually, Trump has a lot to do with this, because this is one of his first deals that he made in the late 70s, which was against the law, but he used the power of his father's purse strings to buy off the mayor and the governor to get these deals, these rezonings passed. So they rezoned so much of the city to make neighborhoods that were, you know, literally not habitable because they were like big factories. You know, and they make it attractive and say like, we're building an artist community, whatever. But when the rates, when rents go up this much, and as a result, when you build these like glass towers, what happens is that the commercial real estate also shifts. And so you're going to lose a lot of mom and pops who don't have rent control either. So literally the lifeblood of this city, if you can't afford to live in your neighborhood, even if you do have affordable housing, because you can only go to a Whole Foods instead of your mom and pop store, or, your local like hair salon is now like a fancy hair salon, or whatever it is in your community shifts, it becomes more expensive and unlivable. And so you're cycling in different types of people who are able to afford those things. And in many cases in New York, there's just the empty real estate, which is the majority of real estate that's being bought up is by foreigners who are using it as a bank account. So you already have this dynamic. There are some predictions saying that New York is going to be an empty city. It's going to be essentially, what they thought was a bank account, but I don't even think, the real estate is supposedly some sort of like safe banking system for these foreigners who don't want to pay taxes and want to hide their money. Who's to say that's even the case anymore?
Well, things are a little bit different here in Brooklyn. Most of the units that have been built recently, in say the last 20 years, are for rent and not for purchase. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind that what you talked about gentrification, landlords have really used that to their advantage. And in fact, one of the things that landlords have done, they've taken tactics like apply for rent abatement programs, which would, in doing so, would make their units rent stabilized, but then somehow finding loopholes to crash out of the programs, or to otherwise, return the benefits that they had. There have been cases of that. I mean, in our case, there were people that moved in here in the early 2000s that signed rent stabilized leases. and subsequently were told, oops, sorry, our bad, you're not really rent stabilized. So the landlord literally used, Alma used regulation as a marketing tool back in the day, and then later subsequently said, well, you know what, we registered all those units as regulated for years, but it was a mistake. You're not regulated. And if nothing else, it's very highly irregular, and it seems contrary to the policies that New York City was supposedly espousing. So, there was cases of other properties that Alma has where the tenants were able to successfully organize and at least negotiate regulated status in the same situation. So, the landlords have been gaming the system, I'll put it that way. And they're taking it, once they see things gentrifying ahead of schedule, it's like, oops, raise prices, make people into market tenants. One of the things that New York State and New York City could do is actually enforce the laws on the books. That would be a good thing.
No, you're right. I mean, it's that's why I say quote unquote rent stabilization, because it didn't really exist in many cases, and they use these loopholes to kick people out of their places and raise the rents. And they're very, very clever with how they do it. They'll have they'll make sure that your apartment is not taken care of and maintained, so that you get so frustrated that you have arguments with them. You might have to go to housing court, whatever it is, and people move out. And then that's their opportunity to remodel that apartment and increase the rent by, 1,000%. I don't know what they did. I've never been actually I have been on one end of it where I had to move out of an apartment. I had no idea. When I first moved to New York, I was in a situation like that, and I had no idea that's what they were doing. There were mice and just a typical New York story, because everyone's got a story like that.
Well, to be fair and objective on the continuum of things, Alma is certainly not off to one side. I mean, I don't think that, it would be fair to say that they are, it's not like we're, it's a horror show in these buildings. I mean, there are issues in the buildings. There are maintenance issues and repair issues. But if, I don't want to infer that, we have, we do have some tenants where the ceilings are actually falling down. God. Yeah, but I mean, generally, as we've been, informed relative to other tenants, we don't have it the worst for sure. So just to be fair.
Oh, that's reassuring. You don't have it the worst. Don't worry.
No, we do not.
Jonathan, really interesting work you guys are doing. Where can folks learn more about you if they want to join, or if they want to duplicate your work and learn about what you're doing in another community? This is how we get people. It's solidarity. We all have to learn from each other and communicate with our neighbors and organize.
If people, we haven't had time to actually make a website. If people want to reach out by email, info@taaffeetenants.org is probably the best way. info at Taaffee.
We'll put in the information. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. info@taaffeetenants.org is the best way to reach us right now. And we'd be happy to, share the documents that we've created. We have a whole infrastructure that we've created. Happy to do whatever helps.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And to our listeners and viewers, we're going to be doing a continuing series on this. This is really obviously very important, and it's changing day by day across the country. This is clearly not something that can continue. We're going to have to move our lawmakers, and unfortunately, I think they're delaying because they're trying to figure it out themselves. But we saw what the housing crisis did to America, to the country, 10 years ago, and I don't think it's going to be much better this time around. So, Jonathan, hopefully we'll talk again soon. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Keep us in the loop. Hope you guys, succeed and make that change happen in Clinton Hill. Wait, who's your new lawmaker? Do you have a new assembly person?
I honestly can't answer that question.
Okay, don't worry, I'll check it out. But the state side, I mean, there's a lot of progress happening out of Brooklyn. So, you're lucky. You're lucky down in Brooklyn.
I will give a shout out to our attorney, Seth Miller from Collins, Dopkin and Miller. He's an amazing person, and we're lucky to have him on our side. So, Seth, thank you for everything you do for us.
Thank you to Ken Klippenstein and to Jonathan Hirschman out of Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, where he's organizing with the tenants over there at the Taaffee Tenant Association. Special thanks to our team at the Nomiki Show, who are behind the scenes, working hard. We're preparing our special coverage for the next 2 weeks of the DNC and the RNC. Thanks to Dorsey, thanks to Kelly, thanks to George, thanks to Ruthie. As I said earlier, you want to make sure to subscribe on YouTube, because that is where we are going to be airing this daily show at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific on YouTube at the Nomiki Show, starting August 17th to August 21st for the DNC, and the following week, the RNC. Majority Report starts, then it finishes up, and at 3 o'clock we go live. It is a live 1 hour show. We're going to be covering all the aspects of the DNC. Very confusing because it will be done virtually. So we're going to make sure to bring on experts, activists, people who have historic knowledge of the DNC, maybe even some centrists to debate, because that's always fun. And then the RNC as well. We're going to be covering whatever happens there. It's still a little bit unclear. But you want to make sure to go onto our YouTube page at The Nomiki Show. And if you're not already on Patreon, you know the jam. Go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. That is how we're able to make that show happen. It is hard work. We start off as a once a week show, and we want to build our capacity up, because that's how shows have to function. We got to pay the bills. We got to pay our team. So thank you to all our patrons who are on there right now. Have a great week. Stay safe. Stay well. Wear your masks. And take care.